Back, everyone. Thank you for joining us again at the Trust Your Gut podcast. We have an exciting show today for you. I'm going to let Erica do the honors today. Thank you, Erica.
All right, guys. Yes, welcome back. Welcome back. Today we have an amazing guest. Dr. Steven Gundry is one of the pioneers of lectin-free living, and he is joining us today, and I'm beyond grateful for this opportunity. I started my lectin-free journey over 4 years ago and continually reap the benefits from this lifestyle. I could not believe my ears when I heard Dr. Gundry on a podcast a few years back. He was saying diabetes, high blood pressure, rheumatoid arthritis could all be treated at the root cause, reversed, and even cured. I personally had lost every single grandparent by my mid-20s and saw most of them struggle with their health for the last years of their life. Cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, liver cirrhosis, emphysema, addiction, rheumatoid arthritis, depression, being overweight and obese are some, but not all of the afflictions that the members in my family, including myself, not anymore, but we have all suffered those. And now knowing the truth and experiencing healing, it's become my sole mission to just spread the word. So without further ado, here is Dr. Steven Gundry, a cardiothoracic surgeon who has published 300 articles, registered several patents for medical devices, is the author of 8 books, has successfully treated tens of thousands of patients that are suffering for autoimmune disorders, diabetes, leaky gut syndrome, heart disease, and neurodegenerative diseases with protocols that detox cells, repairs the gut, and nourishes the body. Dr. Gundry, welcome to the Trust Your Gut podcast.
Erica, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Wow, I don't deserve any of that praise, but I'll take it. What the heck?
It's taken you some years to get here, and I am certainly very, very happy that you've put in all of the work because you've helped so many people, and I'm sure that your work will continue to help more people in the future. So your most recent book is titled Unlocking the Keto Code.
Yep.
It's yet another mind bender.
Yes.
I mean, first you took the lid off eating plants, and now you're taking the lid off eating fats. I mean, with you, it's always been more about what kind, when, and how you prepare foods that provides the best health outcome. And this keto thing has been no exception. It's amazing.
Well, thanks. Thanks. It's designed to stimulate the thought process. So it looks like it did in you as well. So that's good.
Yeah. So the keto diet is very popular nowadays for weight loss. But can you tell us how or why we even discovered the keto diet?
Well, the ketosis was discovered in Germany in the late 1800s, but it really didn't come to fore until the late 1920s, early 1930s, when it was noted that kids with severe seizure disorders, children, they would often have so many seizures that they really didn't wake up and eat, and they were starving. And people noticed that when these kids were starving, their seizures would really dramatically abate. But then they'd wake up and they'd start eating, and the seizures would start. So some smart folks at Boston and the Mayo Clinic said, hey, I think these kids, when they're starving, are in ketosis, and there's something magical that ketones are doing to keep these kids not having seizures. And they didn't really know what that magic was, but they noted that the other way to produce ketosis is to eat a very high fat diet. And so the original ketogenic diet, and the term was coined at the Mayo Clinic, was an 80% fat diet, 10% carbohydrate, and 10% protein. And it was actually very effective for controlling childhood seizures. And it was really what was used until the drugs that we use today, like Dilantin and phenobarb, came along, and then it pretty much fell by the wayside. We'll talk about this in a minute, but in the 1990s, these drugs, while great, still had a lot of side effects. And these kids, for lack of a better word, weren't as mentally bright as maybe they would be without these drugs. And so there was a there was a movement to see if they could make the ketogenic diet, number one, more palatable to children. Any of us who have had children and now grandchildren know it's nearly impossible to deprive a child of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
In fact, it's nearly impossible to deprive anybody of carbohydrates, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book. So they found that if they use MCT oil, medium chain triglycerides, that they could actually dramatically lower the amount of fat in these kids' diet, and they could dramatically increase the carbohydrates and the protein that these kids could eat, and they'd still maintain seizure control. And so there was a real little flurry of interest in the 90s about this. And in fact, I read that literature and I said, this is interesting. So when I did my ketogenic diet version in my books, I based it on MCT oil. And anybody who actually looks at my ketogenic diet before this book notice that, boy, Dr. Gundry's allowing a lot of carbohydrates. What's the deal with that? Well, it was because of the power of MCT. And that's a good segue. So normally when we're starving, we start sending out what are called free fatty acids out of our fat cells. And most of our mitochondria can run on free fatty acids. They love it as a fuel. The problem with free fatty acids is that they're too big to get into the brain. And so the brain doesn't have any glucose, doesn't have any free fatty acids, and that's kind of the end of the road. Well, luckily, free fatty acids go to the liver where they're converted to ketones. And ketones are these short chain fatty acids that are water soluble. And they can pass through the blood-brain barrier. So they can keep the brain alive and working kind of during an emergency, if you will. So MCTs are different than any other fat. They're absorbed directly through the wall of our gut. All other fats have to be carried by basically moving vans to go through the wall of the gut. MCTs don't need that. And they go right through the wall of the gut directly into the liver. And lo and behold, once they reach the liver, they're instantaneously converted into ketones. So the beauty that these researchers in seizure disorders found was, what the heck? The kid could have, a whole pile of fruit or have a stack of pancakes. But if you gave them some MCT oil, which is flavorless and tasteless, they'd be in ketosis even though they ate this gob of carbohydrates. And I said, wow, that's pretty cool. And that got me, really wondering about, well, what exactly are ketones doing that are so miraculous, and they're not a super fuel? But I'll stop there.
Yeah. So with that, the biggest concept basically that you came to figure out was regarding, in ketosis was something that you call, or is called mitochondrial uncoupling, which is the buzzword in your book. It's pretty new for the rest of us. And in the book, you do an amazing job explaining all these hard science stuff. I love how you do that. Guys, if you haven't read it, he turns the mitochondria into a club. And I mean, it's just really fun. It makes it
that was
really
well done. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Well done.
Thank you.
So
yeah.
Can you explain what is mitochondrial uncoupling and how do we benefit from it? We don't have seizures. How do we benefit from this?
Yeah. So I wish I had a better word for mitochondrial uncoupling than mitochondrial uncoupling. And I spent literally 6 months while I was writing the book saying, I got to have a better word for this. And my editor said, we got to do something. The problem is mitochondrial uncoupling is actually well known, and it's a scientific term. And so, to make up a new term kind of goes against, I'm a scientist, among other things.
Right.
So what the heck is mitochondrial uncoupling? So most people remember high school biology class, and everybody remembers seeing these little squiggly things in the cell called mitochondria. And they're the energy producing organelles in all of our cells. And they literally take the food we eat and take oxygen and produce ATP, the energy currency, adenosine triphosphate. And believe it or not, it wasn't until 1978 that how they did this miraculous thing was actually discovered, and it won the Nobel Prize. Sir Peter Mitchell discovered it from England. And what he found was that there's this complex series of events that happens in mitochondria where protons and electrons are energized. They are brought to a fever pitch of wanting to, lack of a better word, mate with each other in the club. And there's loud music, there's drinking, and there's mitochondria. And the purpose is to couple with somebody, and that's what clubs are useful for. So hopefully, so these coupled electrons and protons and oxygen leave the end of the mitochondria through a one-way, actually circular door, and the turnstile. And as they leave, they actually generate ATP. And there literally is kind of a turnstile that you can see in an electron microscope. Okay, so that's cool. But as anybody who goes clubbing knows, a lot of other bad things happen in clubs. There can be too much drinking. There can be some unsavory characters. There can be lots of coupling with people you probably shouldn't be coupling with. And it's very damaging to the club. And so there should be a design that there should be emergency exits in the club instead of just one way in and one way out. So that if things are getting crazy, you can get out of there quickly. And it would be a code violation not to have emergency exits. So it turns out mitochondria have emergency exits. And there's actually 5 emergency exits, and they're controlled by what are called uncoupling proteins. And that's where the name came from. Uncoupling basically says, normally, we should take oxygen and we should take protons and electrons, and we should couple them and produce ATP. But what would happen if a lot of those protons don't get to couple, but instead go out these emergency exits? Well, you'd still be clubbing, you'd still be burning oxygen, but a lot of the people who would normally couple, uncouple and leave the club. And that kind of diffuses everything for a while, and things get back normal until the whole process starts again. So does this actually happen? Well, it turns out it does. And one of the things that amazed me was a paper I discovered that was written by a PhD by the name of Martin Brand in 2000, not long ago. And he wrote this little paper called Uncoupling to Survive. And he said, and it's a good paper, everybody should read it, it's pretty easy reading. He said, look, if you were starving to death, then and you were in ketosis, then the mitochondria, which has to produce energy, should protect itself at all costs. Because if the mitochondria doesn't make it, if the mitochondria is damaged, who cares if your muscles are still there? Who cares about anything? You got to have your mitochondria. So if these conditions are met where ketones are present, then mitochondria ought to be signaled to protect themselves at all costs, and that includes wasting this energy. And you go, well, wait a minute. If there's not much food, what a stupid idea. Why wouldn't you become the most efficient fat burner, eke out every last ounce of ATP? And what I realized was, well, yeah, but here's what additionally happens. Yeah, the mitochondria protects itself by wasting fuel. But simultaneously, and this is what's exciting, the mitochondria is stimulated to make more mitochondria to carry the workload. And I didn't put it in the book, and I should have, because I use it for talking with you. Let's suppose we have a dog sled, and we have one dog on the dog sled, and the dog's the mitochondria. Yeah, the dog can pull the dog sled, and you're not going to go very fast, and you're not going to go very far until the dog gets tired. What if we took 5 more dogs and hooked them to the one dog sled? So now we got a 6-dog sled. We're going to go a whole lot faster. We're going to go a whole lot farther. Each dog is only going to have to do a 1/6 of the work instead of all of the work. And that would be great, except for one thing. You now have to feed 6 dogs instead of 1 dog, right? So what happens with the cool thing about mitochondria is they have their own DNA. They can divide within the cell separate from when the cell has to divide. So you got 1 mitochondria, you want 100 mitochondria, great. Let's send the signals to do that. And some people don't realize, because we all, in high school biology, we saw 1 mitochondria per cell. There can be thousands of mitochondria in every cell. They can be so jam-packed in there that you can't even see through it because of the mitochondria, like a heart muscle, for instance. So long story short, what he was proposing is actually correct. And what he went on to show is that some of the longest living people the healthiest, longest living people have the most uncoupled mitochondria. And so I went, oh my gosh, I want to uncouple my mitochondria. But I knew from patient experience that eating a high-fat ketogenic diet does not last for very long for most people. 60% of people who embark on a high-fat ketogenic diet quit after a month, because you can only eat that many pounds of bacon with a cheddar cheese chaser and dip it in sour cream. It just eventually.
I didn't even make it to a month. I'm going to be honest. I did it for like 3 weeks, and I was like, how do you do this? Like, I love food. I can't and I tried lots of recipes, and it was still so much thought process into it. It's completely unsustainable. It was for me anyway.
Well, and it is for most people. It's just very, very difficult. So, so then I went, well, gosh, yeah, we want to make ketones, not because they're going to make us an efficient fat burner, but because they're actually going to make us an inefficient fat burner. We're going to waste fuel. And that's actually, how you lose weight. But it's really unsustainable. So are there other ways? Now that we know that ketones are working by telling mitochondria to uncouple, then are there other things that actually act like signaling molecules that do the exact same thing without the boredom and the misery? And that's what the book is about. Once you unlock the code that ketones are telling mitochondria, then it just opens up this cornucopia of wonderful things. So that's what's so exciting.
Yeah. So the fact of you don't have to remain in ketosis per se. All you have to tell is your mitochondria to do what they would do during ketosis is basically what the key is. And there are 8 of them that you speak of. The first one is intermittent fasting on the list. And there's several questions that I have on intermittent fasting, because it is one of those polarizing sort of topics when I have with some of my clients, even with Nicole, my podcast partner. We have a little bit of different views on this. So first and foremost, quick explanation. What does it mean to be fasting? What is fasting?
Well, fasting is when you're not eating. It's as simple as that. So, I mean, for instance, when you're asleep, I got news for everybody. You're fasting. Congratulations.
Yeah, the problem is people aren't sleeping enough. So
That's very true. And one of the side effects of not sleeping enough, as we talk about in the book, is you are really limiting the amount of time that you can actually undergo repair work of mitochondria. And getting back to the Mito Club analogy, if you open at say 10 o'clock at night and you close at 4 a.m., well, you've got all day and a lot of the evening to clean up the mess. But if the boss says, "Oh, gee, I'm going to open at just 7 at night and close at 8 o'clock in the morning," and now we've only got a few hours to clean up the mess. And like we now know, mitochondria have to have tons of downtime to clean up the daily mess. And so not eating is when mitochondria normally get the opportunity to clean up the mess.
Absolutely. I agree with that. So what is the difference then? And I might get this a little bit more myself because of my past and the fact that nobody's ever looked at me and thought I was fat or anything like that. So a lot of people hear me say intermittent fasting and they think I'm starving myself. So what is the difference between starvation and intermittent fasting?
Well, a lot of it is time period. So we were clearly designed to survive extended periods without eating. The longest human being to go is 383 days in a supervised water fast, continuous. So we're clearly designed for that. And one of the reasons that we probably, like a locust took over the world is that, our ancestors could go considerable, days, weeks, months without eating because we are laughingly called the fat ape because we could access our fat stores. Having said that, I am not a fan of extended water fasts for Americans. And the reason for that is we store heavy metals and organopesticides in our fat. And quite frankly, they're pretty safe there. It's designed to keep them locked away. I mean, a big old, 1,100 pound tuna with toxic levels of mercury looks like a pretty good fighting fish to me, but it's stored in their fat. And then, we idiots go to the sushi bar and eat tono, the fatty tuna, and we're eating all the mercury that he had stored in the fat. So what was actually really probably the most important experiment that was done in the Biosphere 2 experiment, which was, they built a big old thing in the Arizona desert. You can go visit it still. And they wanted to pretend like they were on the mission to Mars and they were going to try to grow all their own food, make all their own oxygen for a year. And these biospherians were put into this biosphere, and it was an unmitigated failure. These people lost about a third of their body weight in 6 months. And the physician, who was Ray Walford from UCLA, was a calorie restriction guy. And he said, "Wow, this is great. This is great. I love this. Everybody's, starving to death, and this is great. And, their cholesterol numbers drop, their blood pressure drop. This is great." But they eventually abandoned the experiment. They had to start trucking food in. But what they did, and we have to remember that this is written in humans. So they looked at their heavy metals and their organopesticides in their blood, and that went dramatically up. And it took a year for the levels to come back to normal. And wow. You go, wow, I don't really want to do that, do I? Because we have no good detoxification system for heavy metals. And in fact, we literally recycle them in our gut after we squeeze them out from the liver. So I think, a prolonged water fast, even a 3-day water fast is in us, not a great idea. And, Jason Fung is a friend, but I beg to differ. They're Canadians and they're much healthier than us. So, but even Walter Longo, who is a friend from USC, is not a fan of fasting for that reason. But there are other ways to accomplish the same purpose. And what I want to do, and what others have shown is remarkably effective, is to extend the time period in a 24-hour cycle where you are actively producing ketones and get the benefit of ketones uncoupling your mitochondria without, a continuous fast. Now, where's the sweet zone? Most of us, if we have metabolic flexibility, and metabolic flexibility means, can your mitochondria use glucose as a fuel and then switch immediately to burning free fatty acids or ketones as a fuel? And they should be able to do that on a dime, very much like a hybrid car. If you run out of gas, you run on the battery. If you're running on gas, you charge the battery. And we are like a hybrid car in that respect. But 50% of normal weight individuals in the United States have no metabolic flexibility. 80% of pre-diabetic have no metabolic flexibility of overweight individuals. And in obese individuals, 99% have no metabolic flexibility. So if they stop eating, they can't start burning fat as fuel. Sorry, they just can't do it. And so where's the sweet spot? Well, Dr. Matheson from the NIH, looking at studies, thinks that 6 hours is probably the perfect sweet spot. Beginning eating and finishing eating. And that looks simple. You start at noon, you finish at 6. Some people think that's a little draconian. How about 7? How about 8? That's pretty good. We know from athlete studies, Italian athletes, that 12 hours is useless. So, starting eating at 8 o'clock and finish eating at 8 o'clock. It has no health benefit at all. Now, is it a decent place to start? The average American tends to eat 16 hours a day. We put something in our mouth the second we get up, and we don't stop until literally the minute we fall asleep. This is work out of the Scripps Institute in San Diego. It's scary.
I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And that's probably one of the things that shocks people the most too. Like when I say you're going to wait to eat, when I have clients, you're going to wait to eat a couple hours after you wake up. And, if they've never done that, they're like, what?
What?
Some people aren't hungry at all when they wake up. They have no appetite for a while. They're just not hungry until 10, 11, 12 o'clock naturally. But coffee. They do want to get up and drink coffee.
Well, that's great because coffee uncouples your mitochondria. It's one of the best mitochondrial uncouplers there is.
But doesn't it have to be black?
It should be black, but for 2 reasons. Number one, we know that how coffee uncouples mitochondria is the polyphenols in coffee and also caffeine. Caffeine is a mitochondrial uncoupler as well. If you put milk products in, you will actually bind the polyphenols in the coffee, but you'll still get the caffeine effect. You can certainly put MCT oil in your coffee. You could put non-dairy like macadamia nut milk, for example, or hazelnut milk and achieve the same effect. And you won't break ketosis, by the way, which is nice.
Yeah, so that's one of the major questions I always get with the bulletproof coffee or with their morning coffee, can I add protein to my coffee and still remain fasted or be in a fasted state?
In general, the answer is no. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So I'm impressed with Walter Longo's work. He showed actually this past year with human volunteers that you could give them a 200 calorie, basically a nut bar, and they would actually, if they ate that nut bar for their breakfast, they would not break ketosis. And they would continue in ketosis up until they, had their lunch. And that's actually exciting news. And I talk about this in the book. So there are ways around this misery for those of people who really think that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And, thank you, Kellogg's Corn Flakes and Post Toasties, because breakfast is the least important meal of the day. I mean, really, do you think our ancestors crawled out of a cave and said, "What's for breakfast?" There wasn't any breakfast. There's no storage system. There's no there's no cupboards. There's no refrigerator.
Toasters.
Yeah, we had to find breakfast, and you look at hunter-gatherers, modern ones, they don't eat breakfast until 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning when they find something to eat. Breakfast, we think, was invented in the Industrial Revolution in England. And what would happen is that men would be sent off to work very early in the morning, and they'd work all day. There weren't lunch breaks. There weren't, health breaks. Well, you got to have a 15-minute break. and they'd stagger home late at night. And so women would make their husbands, a break fast before they went off to work, because they knew they weren't going to eat until, late at night. And it's interesting. That's actually what we now call the Ramadan diet. And I write a lot about it. Has its own health benefits. But breakfast is this crazy, brand new nutty invention. And
so I have a question about that, because a lot of people will say that if you don't eat breakfast in the morning, your cortisol level will get too high.
Oh, I love that. So my last book, I debunked the cortisol myth. I measure AM cortisols in my patients for the last 25 years, every one of them. And it's very unusual, number one, to see elevated cortisol levels. We got a great fix for it if they have it, but there's no correlation between cortisol and weight gain, number one. Number two, if stress was the main driver of cortisol levels, then every one of us should have had cortisol levels, off the charts for the last 2 years during COVID. And what's fascinating is almost no one in the last 2 years had an elevated cortisol level in my practice. Almost no one. So please, let's, elevated cortisol, I guess, sells books or something, but it's not real. It's really not real. Okay.
So to finish off this first key here real quick, because this is something that you went through on the book that I think people aren't really considering when they're doing prolonged ketosis. And it is that it can make you insulin resistant. Absolutely. Which is something that we started on ketosis to become insulin flexible. And now what are we doing?
Yeah. And again, think about it. So think about it from the mitochondria's standpoint. If we accept that if we're in dire straits, mitochondria should do everything they can to protect themselves. And the signal that tells them to do everything they can to protect themselves are ketones. So imagine now you're in continuous ketosis, 24 hours a day, day after day. There's only one possible explanation for that, and that is you are starving to death. And now anybody else that uses fuel becomes in the body becomes your arch enemy, because that part of the body is going to take your fuel. And so it's no wonder that this protective system would be to take the major consumer of fuel, muscles, and make them insulin resistant. And in fact, you wrote about this in the first book. You can take trained athletes and put them to bed rest for 48 hours, and their muscles will become insulin resistant. Why? Because the only possibility that would have happened was that this athlete was injured and couldn't move. And so these protective mechanisms kick in. And so you see, you hear all my friends saying, oh, it's normal to have a fasting glucose of 120 when you're in ketosis, or it's normal to have insulin resistance in ketosis. That's fake. That's not real. Well, I'm sorry. That is real. That's why this is happening. And why would anybody want to do that, right? We were designed to come and go on a 24-hour basis in and out of ketosis. And even seasonally, we were designed in winter to be probably much more days in ketosis than we were in the summer.
Yeah, and I think that at some point, maybe we can work together and write a book on how this works for the female, right? Because it's a general, right? So we have like cycles of the day and the night, and then we have all this thing, I'm 41. There's a lot of stuff coming down the pipeline. I need to start thinking about other things. And as women, we don't even know this. And most of the science is written in, for the male perspective or the male body.
Sure.
So I think, maybe later on we'll talk about that cycle.
Right. Well,
go ahead.
I mean, yeah, one thing that I see in my practice is if a female wants to get pregnant, then really intermittent fasting, a ketogenic diet is dumb, because you guys have fantastic sensors of your fat status, of your feeding status, and you're not dumb enough to kick out an egg unless you literally have 9 months of fat stores available. And I can't tell you, I take care of a number of elite female athletes, and they can't get pregnant, and they usually don't even ovulate. And and they want to get pregnant. I said, great, we're going to put 10 pounds on you, stuff your face, and the phone rings, say, hey, I'm pregnant. Oh, imagine that. Well, the sensor said, hey, this is our chance. Look, time's right. Let's pop the egg out and let's get it going. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
I agree.
There are people, women, who you really don't want to do this when you're trying to get pregnant. And again, it just comes out. We're a really good design once we kind of figure out what the design was designed to do.
Yeah, that's why I always say, know your gut bugs, because then you feed them and then you're good. And now knowing, how the mitochondria, which in essence is a separate gut bug, like you've been talking about, it just lives with it. It's knowing who you live with is sort of important, because they're in your house and they're like letting whoever in or taking anybody out. And so know your people.
I think, wasn't there a defamation trial all about that recently? Great advice. Know who you live with and who's living in your house.
Oh my goodness.
That's a little off track.
Perfect. It was completely perfect. So we have a few other keys, and I know we don't have an extreme amount of time. So I'm going to run through a few of these so that our listeners know what they are. Number 2 is polyphenols, which if you've read your books, you kind of know about that. Dietary fiber, fermented foods, polyamines was number 5.
What the heck are polyamines?
Yes. So that was one that I was already eating all the food, but not necessarily, I think not everybody knew that they were polyamines and what they do.
Yeah, so polyamines are a class of compounds that are primarily produced in fermentation. These are just by themselves amazing uncoupling compounds. I just released a new supplement that has spermidine in it. I can let you guess where that was discovered. And it actually has some incredible mitochondrial uncoupling processes, and it also makes senescent cells die, but that's a totally another subject. But so aged cheeses are loaded with these polyamines. And there's a beautiful study I cited a few books ago of some Italians. They looked at Italians who ate Parmesan cheese versus Italians who didn't eat Parmesan cheese. And it was a male study. But the men who ate Parmesan cheese actually had much better vascular health, had much better flexible vascular arteries than the men who didn't eat, Parmesan cheese. And it's because the polyamine content is very high in Parmesan cheese. So have yourself some aged cheese.
Don't take the blue pill, just do the Parmesan cheese. I'm pretty sure that's what he said. So the last two were hot temperatures cold temperatures, hot temperatures, and red light therapy. Now, This past winter, I started walking outside during the wintertime with as little clothing as I could, without offending anybody around me, and also without being like completely uncomfortable. Because even though I'm in Southwest Florida, like some mornings were like 38 degrees.
Yeah, you get nippy.
Yeah, it was nippy. But I didn't necessarily know what I was doing mitochondrial uncoupling wise. So I found that out later. This has just been sort of a popular therapy that's been going on. And, cold and hot, is one better than the other? Is there an end result you're looking for?
Well, they actually are activating the exact same thing. And we now realize that both of these therapies uncouple mitochondria. That's how they work. And it's a protective mechanism. When I was doing heart surgery research, we discovered that there were these compounds called heat shock proteins. And that heat shock proteins, we didn't know why, were very protective of heart cells. And we designed bunches of experiments that just before stopping the heart for an hour, we would cut off the blood flow to a part of the heart for 5 minutes and then release it. And we'd show that if we did that before we stopped the heart for an hour, that part of the heart would be much better off than if we didn't do that. And we thought this was what's called a hormetic effect, that which doesn't kill me, makes me stronger. But we now realize that this is a signal that, things are about to get really bad. Cold. Things are about to get really bad. 140 degree sauna. Things are about to get really bad. Mitochondria, protect yourself at all costs. How are you going to do that? You're going to uncouple yourselves so that you can ride out this storm. Believe it or not, in Palm Springs in the summer, we can reach 120 degrees. And we're very popular with German tourists. And they just come out and uncouple with us, I guess,
Oh my gosh, I love that. I have a question about, you mentioned, so the heat therapy, the light therapy, the cold. By the way, I jump in the Pacific for my cold therapy. Hopefully
that's cold therapy, yeah.
And you mentioned fiber, and I just wanted to ask this because a lot of my clients are inflammatory bowel patients. And a lot of them have done really well omitting most plant foods, at least for time.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's because of the fiber. So do you have a position on, whether that for inflammatory bowel patients should be different, or even the carnivore diet? A lot of people use that for a time being. Any thoughts on that?
Well, some people have accused me of being the father of the carnivore diet because there are a lot of plant compounds that do not like us, and I've made my fame talking about lectins. It's very clear, and 80% of my practice now is autoimmune disease and bowel issues. And so, yes, removing these offending plant compounds or neutralizing them by pressure cooking, for instance, is, I think, one of the keys. It's silly for people to say, well, here, you're going to heal your gut by taking all these compounds, and yet they keep putting the things that are, ripping their gut to shred, they're having razor blades for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And they're taking all these healing compounds and wondering why I'm not getting better. So I don't mind an elimination diet at all in these patients, and we have a lot of people who have come to me who have done well on a FODMAP diet, removing all fermentable starches and sugars. But we have to realize that the gut microbiome is absolutely positively dependent on fibrous foods to not only make them grow and divide, but also to produce what are now called postbiotics, which are really one of the keys to long-term health because, among other things, postbiotics uncouple your mitochondria. So we do a lot of food sensitivity testing now. We don't do food allergy testing anymore, and we identify the specific compounds that can be mischievous. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with doing a kind of a full elimination diet and then adding things back. But I'm just dead set against a FODMAP diet as a long-term healthy diet, because you're literally starving the most important part of you to death.
Yeah, makes sense. I did a carnivore diet for 2.5 years, and it did cure a pretty nasty case of ulcerative colitis that I'd had for 7 years. So it did work, but yeah, I think at some point you got to feed the bugs again, and I don't think you can do that without some kind of plant food that you must be able to tolerate.
Yeah, and I think as we're beginning to understand what we should take away, what we should put in, I knock on wood, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's are two of the easiest things I have to deal with, quite frankly. Most people with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, just following the yes and no lists in the plant paradox, 90% of them resolve. Just doing that. So that's exciting. The other thing that most people don't realize, we are profoundly deficient in vitamin D in this country. 80% of Southern Californians are vitamin D deficient when they, because people are throwing sunscreen on.
Yeah, and sitting inside.
And unfortunately, I've got a pretty hard out because apparently somebody else might want to talk with me. Can you imagine?
Oh, come on. No, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to maybe having you again.
Yeah, let me come back and we'll fix the link, funny thing.
We'll fix the link. We'll come back together about the book we wrote, about the cycles and females, and what we should be eating and all that.
Yeah, we should. I mean, I have a wife and 2 daughters and 3 female dogs. So doggone it, I'm ready to be, as you know, I am a huge advocate of females getting the attention you guys deserve for your complaints. Not a day goes by that, I don't have a female new patient going, you mean I'm not crazy?
Yeah, exactly.
No, this is real. Right?
I know, for sure. So we're gonna cross you over, and then we'll just start writing books for females now.
All right, great. Good enough. All right, thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.